Hey all, your OS reviews. The mobile phone space is incredibly competitive, as over the years, numerous rather iconic brands have pulled out altogether, including BlackBerry, LG, and even to a lesser extent, brands like HTC and Sony have definitely decreased their presence compared to the early 2000s. I think Nokia's tale in particular is just really sad and unfortunate as a pioneer once, and I think for many still holds a nostalgic special place in our hearts. However, before they went downhill, they partnered, unfortunately, with Microsoft, that in retrospect was not the greatest decision, and they made exclusively Windows phones after Symbian started to become outdated, and we all know where that went. Windows Phone, Windows Mobile is really no longer with us. And with that, in recent times, there's been a bit of a revival as the Nokia brand seemed to have come back. However, these Android-powered Nokia-branded phones were crafted by HMD Global, which is technically a newer company. It's made up of ex-employees of Nokia and Microsoft's phone division, and they actually purchased the licensing rights as well as certain patents to use the Nokia brand. HMD Global are still headquartered in Finland. Actually, their offices are right across the street from the Nokia headquarters. However, their revival has not been met with the most critical acclaim, in the sense that they haven't really pushed the boundaries too much. I think in their entire legacy till date, they've really attempted only just one or two flagship-grade phones, and everything else has been really centered around nostalgia, creating kind of past models of Nokia devices, as opposed to really innovating and creating new cutting-edge products, especially in the flagship space. That is really, I think, what tech enthusiasts wanted to see. But what's really interesting is that HMD's license to use the Nokia brand on their phones is going to expire in 2026. And so starting now, they're trying to experiment by just putting their own brand, HMD, on the devices instead. This is the first HMD branded phone that's coming here in the United States and can be thought of as a US or North American variant of the HMD Pulse, which is the first phone that came out in Europe. So with this rebranding, I think fans were kind of excited at the possibility of HMD Global perhaps turning a new page and trying to reinvent themselves, try something a little different, but unfortunately, it seems like this debut has taken a very similar route as what they've done with all of their Nokia branded phones, which is to say still very much in the budget to mid-range category. That being said, the HMD Vibe here in the US is actually kind of interesting because it is so low cost. The no-contract prepaid version of this phone that you can just pick up from Walmart, for example, or online through sites like TrackPhone, as well as Straight Talk, Total by Verizon, actually goes as low as $40, and you can purchase it just to use it as a MP3 player, a backup device, even if you wanted to. It's kind of a ridiculously low cost. That being said, this version of the phone comes with 3 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigs of storage, although there is a slightly higher configured model that comes with 6 gigabytes of RAM, 128 gigs of storage, basically doubling the memory on board, that goes for $150. This is an unlocked variant. HMD Global is trying to position this phone as an alternative to something like the TCL branded phones, or the recently released Blueview 5 on prepaid networks also is another example that comes to mind, in addition to options we've checked out lately, such as the new A15, as well as maybe even some Motorola phones like the Moto G Power, as well as the Moto G Stylus, the base 4G versions, all retail at a similar cost. However, as compared to those other models, what's surprising is HMD Global used a Qualcomm Snapdragon 680 processor, which is an octa-core chip. It's a 6-nanometer architecture, which is actually pretty energy efficient. It's a little faster and more performant than what the norm is on these super budget phones. For example, the Moto G Stylus 2023 here, the 4G version uses the Helio G85, which by contrast is a 12-nanometer architecture. It's going to be less power efficient, and similarly, both the CPU as well as the GPU performance are going to be slightly weaker compared to Qualcomm's processor. So again, it is a little bit surprising that Nokia or HMD Global didn't just use a MediaTek processor like the rest. I'll also point out that the European version of this phone, called the HMD Pulse, has a very similar design overall, although there are a few more colors to choose from, including more of this pink, as well as a bluish shade, in addition to black that we have here, uses a weaker processor. It's a Unisoc T606. To many folks outside of the tech community, Unisoc might be even less known than MediaTek. However, that processor is also based on a 12nm architecture similar to the Helio G85 compared to the more efficient 6nm of the Snapdragon 680 here. And there's another model out of the trio of products from HMD Global called the Pulse Pro, which has a slightly better main camera as well as a little bit more RAM, but this one as well, even the Pro model, still is using the same Unisoc T606 processor for rest of world markets. And in terms of benchmarks, the T606 is pretty similar to the Helio G85, which is to say it's going to be weaker in both CPU as well as especially GPU performance compared to the chip on the HMD Vibe over here. So overall, what is interesting is that this model is the most performant from a processing perspective out of the HMD branded phones on the market right now. The HMD Vibe has up to 3 GB of additional virtual memory or virtual RAM expansion. So that's a trick that we have seen in some other devices recently, where in the software it borrows some of the ROM, in this case 64 GB, to augment the RAM and hopefully improve on the multitasking a little bit. So the 6 gigs of RAM total includes 50% of virtual RAM. Otherwise, the phone comes with a 13-megapixel rear primary camera and a 5-megapixel selfie lens. They are using a hole punch cutout for the display here, as opposed to a teardrop notch that is a lot more common on other budget phones in this price category, so at least that seems alright. It is a 720p HD plus resolution IPS LCD panel though, as opposed to Full HD. And at the very least, this is a 90Hz adaptive refresh rate screen, meaning that when you turn that function off, scrolling doesn't feel quite as choppy or sluggish. And again, it's actually not a bad looking display, especially when it comes to design as well as bezels versus other budget phones that we have seen in the past. And the display here measures 6.5 inches diagonally, so it's good enough for media consumption, a pretty average sized phone these days. And we also have access to a secondary rear camera that's just used for bokeh and depth sensing. However, it's not being used as a ultra wide angle, nor is there going to be a telephoto or even a macro lens on this setup, pretty basic, as well as an LED flash. Connectivity wise, because the Snapdragon 680 is a 4G chip, it just supports 4G LTE, so no 5G, but I think in most cases for just simple communications, especially on such a low cost device, it doesn't really matter, I would say. You can get by with the basics, and you also have access to Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth, in addition to GPS for navigation. That being said, there is no NFC built onto this phone, so for contactless mobile payment, unfortunately, that's going to be out of the question. You do have, however, a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, which is a relic that seems to be preserved, ironically enough, on a lot of these lower-end phones. So again, if you're picking one up just to act as a media player, as some type of iPod replacement, maybe to give as a child for music, that still seems to do an okay job. It is a single speaker setup, however, one at the bottom, as opposed to a stereo speaker. However, it does have 2 microphones that are used for audio pickup. Otherwise, the device comes with a 4,000 milliamp hour capacity battery inside, and unfortunately, charging is quite slow at only 10 watts. In fact, that even is lower than the Google Pixel, but since the cell here isn't gigantic, it takes roughly 2 hours to fully charge up, and inside of the packaging, you will find just the standard 10-watt charger, which is using USB Type-A, branded by HMD Global, as well as a USB Type-C cable. It does, interestingly, also have FM radio capability that can work in both wireless and wired modes if you plug in a headphone to act as the antenna, or you can use Bluetooth headphones, and both seem to do the job. It's also rated to be splash-proof, so you can't really submerge it in water, but if it gets wet in the rain or splashing something in the kitchen, it should still survive. And also, the SIM card slot can also act as a memory card slot that supports a micro SD up to 1 TB, so you can thankfully augment the built-in storage further. That being said, one other slightly disappointing aspect of this phone is it doesn't have any biometric fingerprint scanner, which is also a little curious because many of the competitors, including the aforementioned new A15, as well as the Moto G Power and G Stylus, both have an integrated fingerprint scanner on the power key. Increasingly, more and more of that is standardized, but on this model, you are left with just the face unlock, which is relatively fast. However, again, it's not quite as secure or accurate as a real fingerprint scanner, so you can rely on that or the password or PIN style instead. So some compromises here, again, notably in the charging speed as well as in the fingerprint scanner, but a lot of the other attributes, including the display, refresh rate, as well as again, having a slightly faster processor are all slight surprises, I would argue. And I think it straddles a fine line between boring as well as minimalistic. So, of course, with this particular brand, they've always tried to make super streamlined design decisions, but in this particular instance, it might be just a little bit too plain, but still clean looking at the end of the day, I would say. There's a slight texture to the polycarbonate plastic that's being used here, which is almost like a sandstone texture, making it a little easier to grip. The camera module has a slight protrusion, but it's really not bad. It doesn't really wobble onto a table or desk. And on the right-hand spine, there's access just to the volume rocker as well as the power key. Changing to a pink background here because HMD Global have also recently announced a partnership to license Barbie branded phones. So at least they're trying some different things, but we'll have to see if any of it really sticks. Only time will tell. Now, the software experience here is extremely Spartan and it's quite vanilla. It is running on Android 14 here out of the box, but unfortunately, like most other budget phones, it's not really expected that they will release subsequent OS level upgrades aside from what comes here out of the box, although you do get 2 years of security upgrades and patches. Otherwise, if you're picking up the prepaid version of the phone, you will find a handful of bloatware from, say, TracFone or Verizon, but thankfully it just takes a few minutes to uninstall a lot of these apps. So for example, some weather widgets, as well as you also get Facebook, not to mention a handful of other games, including titles like Royal Match, as well as even a news app, Crossword. So a lot of these things can just be uninstalled, but it's just a little bit irksome. They come bundled with the phone. So that is one of the benefits, I suppose, of getting a completely unlocked version. Is you don't have to clean anything up and you'll be ready to go. But once you are finished, you'll be able to end up with a result that looks something like this. HMD Global also provides you with just 2 or 3 custom wallpapers. Not a ton, but you can find other standards that we've been seeing on Android for a while now, but some of these bubble ones are created by them. Here's a quick comparison just for reference of the similarly priced Moto G Stylus / G Power, the base models, which has a very similar screen to body ratio, I would say. Of course, both have flat displays, so you don't have any accidental triggers from curved screens that you have to really contend with, ironically enough, here on a budget phone. Now, jumping into the settings that you can also pull down on the bottom of the device, there's not a ton of customization here, although if we jump into options like battery, you do have the ability to limit the charging with adaptive battery up to, say, 80% to preserve the battery health in the long term if you're leaving it plugged in overnight. And in normal usage, I was able to operate the device for around 6.5 to 7 hours of screen on time more conservatively, and that resulted in around a day and a half of use to maybe 2 days if you're a little bit lighter before you have to charge it up again. What is disappointing though is I haven't been able to find the advertised virtual RAM expansion mode under the memory options. So supposedly on here is where you'd be able to add again up to 3 gigabytes of additional RAM as the website claims to boost the multitasking capabilities, but on this particular software version, as you can tell, there's only an auto cleanup to clear the background apps when they're not being used, or you can tap to boost to basically clear out of any unused applications and close them up, but there is no virtual RAM button down below that supposedly is found in the settings. So we'll have to see if they provide that over an OTA software update in the coming days, but if not, then that's a little bit of a false advertisement. That is not good. Now under display here though, we are able to change properties like the white balance, cooler versus warmer, as well as down below you can toggle between the refresh rate of adaptive up to 90 Hz versus standard 60 Hz. There is actually a pretty big difference when you turn the adaptive refresh rate on, so I would personally just leave it on to 90 Hz, especially when the phone first starts up and you're trying to install a lot of software updates. It actually becomes a little bit choppy as it's trying to process everything and set it up. Thankfully, once that setup process is over, it seems like performance has settled in, and now it's getting a little bit smoother. It's actually more in line with what I expected from a Snapdragon 680 level of performance. So again, just keep that in mind, and turning on the high refresh rate screen does make it feel just a bit smoother and faster. Some final quick gestures that HMD Global built in, including double tap to wake the screen, also work pretty much as advertised. You also have the ability to flip the phone over to mute an incoming call or alarm. And if you're picking up the 64 gigabyte version, keep in mind that roughly 16 to 18 gigs will be occupied by the software, the OS that is, but overall it still leaves you with a decent amount of space, but I would recommend augmenting that using a memory card if you feel like it's getting too cramped. So overall, a pretty Spartan software experience, not too much that HMD Global have done on top of regular Android. I think for the most part that's a good thing. You'll find just the standard Google apps pre-installed, as well as the Play Store, of course, and also a FM radio app, in addition to a HMD Global My Device app, are all the ones that you get from HMD themselves. Now, taking a quick look at the camera next, this is another area where typically on budget phones we don't expect a lot, and that's pretty much what you're getting here on the HMD Vibe. It's just going to be very basic software experience. You can swipe down here to access a few more menu options. Now, on the advertising, HMD Global also claimed both HDR and AI functionality, but on here I really only see the auto HDR, which does make a difference. But I'm not really seeing an option to toggle AI functions on or off. There's just Google Lens support for recognizing barcodes, but that's certainly not a camera profile for changing color or saturation. But at least there is a night mode for capturing a little bit more details in lowly lit environments, as well as a interesting bokeh effect that you can apply in the portrait mode that can turn some of the background lights into round dots, into stars, as well as hearts or even butterflies based on your preferences. And the UI is at least intuitive. That being said, you don't really get any pro controls on here, just a beauty mode that you can apply if you're taking portraits, but that's pretty much it. You can't really capture in RAW or adjust even properties like ISO or white balance manually using the default camera app at least. Video can be captured at full HD resolution, but even the ability to change the res lower or capture, say, slow-mo can't really be found in the current version of the camera app. So it is extremely basic, but kind of expected for a super budget phone, I would say. Here's an example of the night mode being practiced. Since it doesn't have optical image stabilization, you definitely have to hold quite still. And this camera is definitely not on the same level as a Pixel or iPhone, but that's kind of expected, I would say, for a super budget device. It's comparable to some of the other phones that we looked at previously when it comes to overall level of performance that you can expect. And scanning in text at least looks clear enough, even though there's not the most punchy or vibrant looking colors in the world, but still is acceptable, I would say, for a budget phone. Just nothing really mind-blowing. Here's also a quick web browsing test. And as you can tell, loading back pages still seems to do an alright job, which is, I guess, not too surprising because of the Snapdragon 680 processor in here, so being good enough for these basic tasks. That being said, RAM management definitely seems to struggle a bit on the base 3GB version, so I was able to open up really just 3 or 4 tabs in the background. Anything more than that, it would just re-render the previous pages, and the same goes with background apps as well. So I do think the virtual RAM would have definitely helped, especially on a budget model. So even though the processor and GPU are quite capable if you're doing just one thing at a time, if you are trying to do multiple things in the background, just keep in mind that you may have to close them up or take a few seconds for them to kind of re-snap into focus when you jump back in. But overall, good enough in terms of antenna reception quality at least. Didn't really have any issues staying connected to both Wi-Fi and 4G LTE. And when it comes to, again, just single applications, the responsiveness has been satisfactory. Here's also a quick video consumption test with the built-in speakers. So takeaway being that it does get sufficiently loud, and it's clean sounding at the very least, but obviously doesn't have the true immersion of a stereo set. But again, having a regular headphone jack in addition to support for Bluetooth is definitely a win, making it not a bad media player. So you can scrub back and forth between parts of the video, and responsiveness seems to be decent. When it comes to playback, you can do picture-in-picture, and that still works all right. And as far as doing a little bit of gaming is concerned, we'll still notice some moments of occasional hesitation. As you can tell there, a little bit of drop frames, especially when you're first loading up a few titles. But generally speaking, especially for more casual gaming that you're doing on here, more puzzle style as well as lighter titles, it actually does a reasonable job, as you can tell, more than playable enough, I would say. All in all, though, not too bad when it comes to just some light and casual gaming here at the end of the day. So there we have it, just a closer look at the HMD Mobile Vibe, also known as the HMD Pulse, again in European markets, and all in all, it's definitely not a super exciting start to kind of a soft relaunch of their brand. That being said, for a device that you can pick up, especially here in the US for just $40 without a contract, it is actually not as bad as expected from a value perspective. With that being said, there are still a few shortcomings here. Primarily, I have a couple of issues with the kind of false advertising on the virtual RAM expansion function. I think it's actually quite critical, especially on a lower power device, to bring that option to make the phone feel a little bit more responsive when you're multitasking. But all things considered, it's surprisingly not too shabby, I have to say. Again, keeping the super budget price in mind. And maybe just ending this video on a couple of comments that I saw you guys posting on sites such as GSM Arena when the phone was announced, which I find to be actually quite funny, including this one here. I see no vibe. HMD Vibe, more like Vibe Destroyer. Didn't pass the vibe check. Yeah, I definitely feel the vibe. Bankruptcy. And for the European version, Pulse, more like a flat line. Some of you guys are brutal. That being said, I can understand where you're coming from because it is truly not a super exciting phone. I think part of the higher expectations that we have towards HMD stems from the iconicness of the original Nokia brand from back in the day. So one can only hope that they continue pushing and creating more powerful, exciting products in the future. It's a bit of an ironic name, but in this particular instance, I actually think it's not a bad choice as just a backup phone, perhaps to use again as a media player with a half-solid processor, at least, compared to some of the other alternatives at a similar price range. So if you are interested, you can check out more in the links down below. Again, a company that we will be tracking more and seeing what they will bring out later on. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here are OS reviews. That's been HMD's entry into the US market with their own name, at least on a device, the HMD Vibe.